The bruise on her wrist was shaped like his hand. That was the part nobody could explain later. Not the courtiers who'd watched him do it, not the guards who dragged her from the hall, not even Marin herself. Lying awake, 3 nights after, turning her arm in the moonlight like the mark might say something her own memory wouldn't. He had not gripped her hard enough to bruise. She was sure of that. She would have sworn it on the old gods and the new ones both. His hand had closed around her wrist in front of 400 witnesses, and the pressure had been nothing. A king's hand on a girl he was about to throw away, careless, contemptuous, done. And yet the mark bloomed dark by morning, perfect as a brand, 4 fingers and a thumb, like something had been pressed into her on purpose. Let's go back. Let's start where it actually started, in the cold in front of everyone. The great hall of Aldermere held its breath the way only 400 nobles can, performed. Theatrical. Each person's silence a little louder than the last, so the king would know how shocked they were. Calder stood on the dais in the blackened iron of House Vrail, broad enough to block the hearth fire behind him, and he looked at Marin the way a man looks at a debt he's tired of carrying. "You presumed," he said. His voice didn't rise. It never needed to. "You presumed a great deal coming here." Marin stood in the open floor where they'd put her, not near the throne, never near the throne, a good 10 paces of cold stone between her and the man who, 4 nights ago, had pressed his mouth to the inside of her elbow like it was something holy. She had a single white streak in her hair, just above her left temple, 2 fingers wide, that she'd had since she was 9 years old, and a fever nearly took her. She used to hate it. Tonight, under 400 pairs of eyes, she was glad for it. Glad for one thing about her body that wasn't being weighed and found wanting in real time. "My lord," she started. "Don't." Calder's jaw worked once. "Don't call me that. Not anymore." A laugh went through the hall, thin and cruel, the kind of laugh that costs nothing and means everything. Somewhere to her left, a woman in deep plum velvet smiled behind her fan. A smile with too many teeth in it. A smile Marin would not understand the danger of for 3 more days. "There is no bond," Calder said. "There was never going to be a bond. You mistook a king's courtesy for a king's intention, and that is a mistake commoners make about alphas every season. I am not unkind for correcting it. I would be unkind to let it continue." Every word landed like a dropped stone, and Marin felt each one separately, distinctly. The way you feel each stare when you fall down a flight of them. "Take her out," Calder said, not to her. To the guard at the door. Gently. It was the last gentle thing he said for 15 feet. Then his hand closed on her wrist. Too fast, too sudden. The kind of grab that says, "Get away from me," in front of a room that needs to hear it said in skin. And 400 nobles watched their king eject a nobody from his court with his own hands. And not one of them thought to wonder why, if he wanted her gone, he was the one walking her to the door. The corridor past the great hall was dim, lit only by every 3rd sconce, the stone breathing cold up through the soles of her slippers. Marin walked fast, faster than dignity required. Because dignity was already gone, and all that was left was getting out of that hall, before her face did something she couldn't take back. She didn't hear him until he was beside her. "Marin." She kept walking. "Marin. You said my name like that in here 3 nights ago," she said, not stopping, and it meant something different. His hand caught her elbow this time, not her wrist, lighter, almost careful, and she rounded on him with 400 humiliated nobles' worth of fury behind her eyes. And that was when she saw his face, properly. For the first time since he'd called her a presumption in front of the whole court. He looked like a man who'd swallowed glass, and was still walking around like it hadn't cut him. "Don't touch me," she said. He let go immediately, both hands up, an inch from surrender. "I know what that looked like. I know what it was. It wasn't." He glanced once down the corridor behind them, toward the hall, toward the doors, toward the firelight, spilling under them like something listening. "It wasn't real, Marin. None of it. I needed every person in that room to believe it, which meant I needed you to believe it, because you're not good at lying and they would have smelled the lie on you in a heartbeat. Smelled it. Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the word. That's rich, coming from the man who can't smell anything on me he didn't put there. He flinched. Actually flinched. A king. In a servant's corridor, over one sentence from a woman he'd just publicly discarded. There are people in that hall, he said, low now, low and fast, who would have killed you the moment they confirmed the bond. Not exiled you, not shamed you. Killed you, Marin, in your bed, in a hallway. In a kitchen. It wouldn't have mattered where, only that it happened before the claiming could finish. I rejected you because the alternative was burying you. The torchlight caught the line of his throat as he said it, whilst the muscle there pulled tight enough to show. Marin stood very still. That's a convenient thing to say, she said. After you've already won. I haven't won anything. His voice dropped further, rough at the edges now, like something scraped raw. I have a court that thinks I'm cruel and a girl who thinks I'm a liar, and I would take either one of those over a court that thinks I love you, because that thought gets you dead inside a week. Somewhere behind them, a door opened, and they both went still as stone. 2 breaths held in one corridor, until it closed again and the silence came back like water filling a footprint. 5 minutes, he said, when it was safe to speak again. Give me 5 minutes that aren't for them. She should have said no. She thinks about that a lot, later, the version of herself who said no in that corridor, who walked away and let the rejection be the whole and only truth of it. That version of her doesn't exist. The real one stood there with her bruising wrist and her wounded pride and said nothing, which called her, fluent in the particular silences of women who've been hurt, correctly read as, yes, but you'll have to earn it. He didn't touch her again. That was the strange mercy of it, a king known for taking what he wanted, standing 2 feet back, hands open at his sides, asking instead of claiming. I am not a good man performing badly, he said. I am trying to keep you breathing in a court built by people who have been killing inconvenient women for 200 years and calling it tradition. I will do it again tomorrow if I have to. I will do it every day until the threat is gone, and I will hate every single time, and you are allowed to hate me for it too. But you are not allowed to think it was nothing. Why not? Her voice was small now, smaller than she wanted it to be. Everyone else gets to think that, because everyone else didn't feel my hand shake when I let go of your wrist. She looked down at her wrist. It hadn't bruised yet. That would come by morning, dark and deliberate, like the mark of something pressed into her on purpose. But she could still feel the ghost of his grip there, and underneath the anger, underneath the humiliation still hot in her chest. Something in her recognized the shape of a man telling the truth badly, because the truth was the only thing he had left to give her in a hallway with guards. 20 feet away. This doesn't fix it, she said. I know. I'm still furious with you. I know that too. Good. She stepped back. The torchlight cut a line down the center of his face, half gold, half shadow, and she made herself memorize it, because some animal part of her, newer than 3 weeks old, older than she could explain, already understood she'd be asked to forget this conversation existed by sunrise. Don't follow me to my door. He didn't. He watched her go instead, all the way to the turn in the passage where the stone darkened and her white-streaked hair disappeared around the corner, and stood there long enough that a kitchen girl carrying linens nearly walked into him and apologized 3 times before he told her, gently, that it was nothing. Go on, get to bed. He did not move for another full minute after that. This is the part the court never saw. 400 people watched a king reject a nobody in front of a roaring hearth, and exactly none of them watched him stand alone in a servant's corridor, afterward, with his hand pressed flat against the cold stone wall like he was trying to hold something in. What the court believed in the days that followed was simple and tidy and almost entirely wrong. They believed Marin had overreached. A merchant's daughter, raised on the eastern coast where the packs ran smaller, and the kings were closer to their people, arriving at Aldermere with a recommendation letter and a scent that, rumor had it, though no one official confirmed it, had turned the king's head the first night she walked into his hall carrying ledgers for the treasury master. They believed she'd mistaken 6 weeks of proximity for promise. They believed Calder, cold as a winter river, had simply corrected an error before it became a scandal. They were wrong about the error. They were right, in a way none of them intended, about the scandal. Lady Sorrel, the woman in plum velvet, the one with the smile that had too many teeth in it the night of the rejection, kept a small gold hairpin shaped like a thorn, worn always at the same angle above her left ear, tilted exactly 12 degrees. A detail so precise it had become a kind of signature among the court's gossiping circles. She found Maren 3 days later in the herb garden behind the kitchens, where Maren had taken to working in the mornings because it was the one place in the castle no one expected to find her, and therefore the one place no one bothered watching her. "You handled that beautifully," Sorrel said, settling onto the stone bench like she'd been invited. Maren didn't look up from the rosemary she was cutting. "Handled what?" "The humiliation." Sorrel's voice was warm, almost kind, which made it worse. "Most girls cry. You didn't cry." The whole hall noticed. "I'm so glad I gave everyone something to talk about." "You did." Sorrel leaned in, conspiratorial, and for one unguarded second, something flickered across her face that wasn't cruelty at all. Something closer to pity, closer to warning, gone before Maren could name it. "Be careful, little thorn girl. Court memory is short for triumphs and very, very long for humiliations. Yours has already outlived its season. Make sure you don't." Then she was gone, plum velvet sweeping over gravel, gold pin catching the light, and Maren sat in the herb garden with rosemary oil stinging a cut on her thumb, and the distinct, crawling feeling that she'd just been warned about something she didn't understand. She didn't know yet that Sorrel's husband sat on the Iron Council. She didn't know yet what the Iron Council had voted on. 11 days before the rejection, in a chamber with no windows and a single locked record, kept in a script only 3 men in the kingdom could read. She knew only that the bond hadn't faded. That was the strange cruelty of it. The part no story about public rejection prepares you for. A faded bond, once it starts forming, doesn't care what was said in a hall full of witnesses. It doesn't care about pride or performance or political necessity. Maren still woke at the same hour every night that Calder did, some thread between them pulling taut across 200 feet of castle stone, and some mornings she caught herself standing at her window, facing the exact direction of his rooms, before she'd even fully woken up enough to be ashamed of it. She hated that most of all. Hated that her body kept choosing him, even while her mind was still composing the speech, where she told him exactly what she thought of corridors and confessions and men who explained themselves only after the damage was already done. She never got to give that speech. Calder found ways to be near her that looked, to anyone watching, like coincidence. The treasury master needed her ledgers reviewed in the same hour the king happened to be auditing grain stores. The herb garden needed pruning the same week the king took to walking there before dawn, alone, no guard, hands clasped behind his back like a man working through a problem he couldn't solve, standing still. They didn't speak much, those mornings. That was its own kind of confession. Once, their hands brushed reaching for the same basket of cut sage, and neither of them pulled away fast enough, and the silence that followed had a weight to it that 400 nobles in a hearth-lit hall would never have believed of the cold king who'd thrown a girl out by her wrist. "You're not supposed to be here," Maren said, eventually into that silence. "Neither are you." His thumb moved, once, against the side of her hand, not quite a caress, not quite an accident. And yet, she agreed, and didn't move her hand away either. That was the closest they came to touching, for 11 days. A basket of sage. A thumb that moved once. A king who'd rejected her in front of his whole court, and now couldn't seem to walk past a garden without finding a reason to be in it. The line, when it finally got crossed, wasn't crossed by either of them on purpose. It happened in the library, 2 floors above the herb garden, on a night when half the castle was at a midwinter feast. Marin had not been invited to, and Calder had excused himself from on the thin pretext of correspondence. The library at that hour held nothing but candlelight, dust, and the particular hush of 1,000 books agreeing to keep a secret. Marin was there for a treasury record. Calder was there if he was honest with himself, which he was trying lately, to be more often, for her. "You weren't at the feast," he said, from the doorway, like it was a casual observation and not a fact he'd been tracking since the musicians started. "I wasn't invited." She didn't look up from the ledger. Strange, that. Being the woman the king humiliated in front of his entire court tends to thin out one's invitations. "Marin, it's fine." It wasn't. Her voice didn't shake, but her hand did, just slightly, turning the page. "I'm working it out." He crossed the room slower than he meant to, or exactly as slow as he meant to. Some part of him still deciding which it was, and stopped close enough that she could smell wood smoke and cold air on his coat, close enough that the candle between them threw both their shadows onto the same shelf. "I keep thinking," he said, "about the bruise." Her hand stilled on the page. "I didn't grip you that hard," he said. "I know I didn't, and it bruised anyway, dark as a brand, by morning. I haven't been able to stop thinking about what that means." "What does it mean?" "I think it means the bond doesn't care what I tell the court." His voice had gone rough again, the way it had in the corridor. Like the careful king's register was a coat he could only wear so long before it chafed. "I think it means some part of you marked some part of me. The same night I tried to convince 400 people I felt nothing for you, and I have spent every day since trying to decide if that's the cruelest joke the gods have ever played on me or the only honest thing left in my life." Marin closed the ledger, slowly, deliberately. The candle between them guttered once in a draft neither of them caused. "You don't get to say things like that," she said, "and then put me back outside the hall doors tomorrow like nothing happened." "I know. I mean it, Calder. I won't keep doing this garden, this almost 11 days of near touches and basket sage, and you finding reasons to stand close enough that I can feel you not touching me. If this is real, it has to cost you something where people can see it. Otherwise, it's just." Her voice caught. "Otherwise, it's just another performance. And I've had enough of being your stage." He didn't answer right away. The candle burned. Somewhere below them, faint through the stone, the feast's music swelled and then settled, and a draft moved the dust motes between them like something deciding whether to fall. "There's a faction on the Iron Council," he said finally. "That voted 3 weeks ago to kill any woman I claimed who wasn't born to one of the 7 founding packs. They voted it in secret, in a chamber I'm not technically permitted inside without 4 witnesses, and I only know about it because one of those 4 witnesses owed me a debt older than your grandmother." The room went very quiet. "That's not a metaphor," he said. "That's not me being dramatic to win an argument in a library. There is a literal, written vote, with a literal date, that says a girl with no founding blood who completes a bond with the Alpha King of Aldermere does not survive the season. I rejected you in that hall because the vote needed to believe it had won before it found a reason to act." Marin's mouth had gone dry. "Who voted for it? I don't know all of them." A muscle moved in his jaw. "I know Lord Councilvey did. I suspect his wife knew before the vote happened, which would explain a hairpin and a warning in a herb garden that I assume you've already had and not told me about." "How did you?" "She watches you the way people watch a fire they started by accident. Guilty and fascinated in equal measure." He exhaled, and something in his shoulders dropped, just slightly. The posture of a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying since the corridor. I have spent 11 days trying to find a way to protect you that doesn't require telling you any of this, because the moment you know, you become a target who knows she's a target, and that is its own kind of danger. I am telling you anyway, because I would rather you hate me informed than adore me lied to." Marin stood there with the ledger cold under her palm, and the candlelight unsteady on both their faces, and somewhere in her chest the anger she'd been carrying since the Great Hall didn't disappear. It never fully would, not even at the end of this, but it shifted, made room for something colder and more useful. Fear. Real fear, the kind that sharpens instead of paralyzes. "Then we do it your way," she said. "For now. But you tell me everything. No more corridors where I find out the truth 3 sentences too late." "Everything," he agreed. It wasn't a kiss what happened next. It was closer than that and further than that, at once, his forehead dropping to rest against hers, both their breaths held in the small space between them, his hand finally closing around hers on the cover of the ledger, deliberate this time, no performance in it, no audience to convince. "I should go back to the feast," he said, not moving. "You should." Neither of them moved for a long moment after that, and when he finally did pull back, it was with the particular reluctance of a man leaving a fire he'd rather stay beside. And Marin stood alone in the library afterward, with her pulse loud in her ears, and the unmistakable, terrifying knowledge that whatever was between them had just stopped being a thing she could walk away from. She did not yet know how wrong she'd had it, 3 weeks running, about who the threat actually was. She thought the danger was the court's judgment. Gossip, status, a wounded reputation she'd carry for a season and outlive. She had not understood until that library that the danger had a name and a vote and a date, and that it had been real from the very first night Calder's hand closed too gently around her wrist in front of 400 witnesses who never once wondered why a king who wanted a woman gone would be the one to walk her to the door. The faction moved on a night that began, deceptively, like every other night that winter. Cold, ordinary, candlelit. Marin had taken to sleeping in the smaller chamber off the treasury, a room with one window and a door that locked from the inside, because Calder had asked her to, quietly, 2 nights after the library, and because some new caution in her had agreed without needing to be told twice why. She woke to the smell of smoke that wasn't from her own hearth, not the comfortable smoke of a banked fire. Sharper, closer. The kind of smoke that comes from a flame set somewhere it shouldn't be, and beneath it, fainter, something bitter and chemical that made the back of her throat close before her mind had finished, deciding she was awake. The door handle moved, once, testing the lock. She was on her feet before she'd consciously chosen to be, back against the cold stone wall, every instinct she'd been born with, screaming the same single word. The handle moved again, harder this time, and then there was a sound like metal against the lock's mechanism. Patient, practiced, the sound of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. She did the only thing she could think to do. She screamed Calder's name once, as loud as her body would allow, and then she screamed it again, and on the third one the door splintered inward not from the lockpick but from a shoulder. And for one terrible half-second, she didn't know which side of the danger had broken through first. It was a guardsman, not Calder's. Plum and gray livery, the colors of House Vey, and behind him, a second man with a blade already drawn, and no attempt at all to hide his face, because men who don't intend to leave witnesses don't bother with masks. What happened in the next 90 seconds? Marin would only ever describe later in fragments, the cold edge of the window ledge against her spine as she backed toward it with nowhere left to go. The first man's hand closing on her arm, rougher than Calder's had ever been, no restraint in it at all. Her own hand finding the iron poker by the cold hearth and swinging it with more fury than skill. Catching him hard enough across the wrist that he dropped his grip with a sound she'd hear in her sleep for months. And then the door behind both men exploding inward a second time, and Calder filling the frame of it, bare-chested, sword already in hand, a king who had clearly run the length of the castle without stopping to dress. And the look on his face was not the cold mask from the great hall. It was nothing like that mask. It was something raw and furious and entirely, finally honest. "Get away from her," he said, and it was not a request. The second guard ran. The first one didn't get the chance to. It was over fast. Faster than Marin's racing heart could keep pace with, the kind of violence that happens in seconds and leaves you shaking minutes after it's already finished. When it was done, Calder crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her against his chest so hard the breath went out of her, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other arm locked around her like he could weld the 2 of them together through sheer refusal to let go. "I'm fine," she said into his collarbone, her voice not entirely steady. "I'm fine, Calder." "You're not." His voice was wrecked. "You're shaking. So are you." He didn't deny it. They stood like that long enough for the guard captain to arrive, for torches to fill the corridor outside, for the castle to wake fully into chaos around them. And through all of it, Calder did not let go of her. Not for an arrest, not for a report, not for the moment Lord Counsel Vey himself appeared in the doorway, summoned by the noise, his face arranging itself into an expression of concerned surprise that didn't reach his eyes fast enough to be convincing. "My king," Vey said, "what in the gods' names has happened?" "Your livery," Calder said. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. The room had gone dead silent around him. "On the man who broke into this room with a blade drawn against a woman who has done nothing but exist in your line of sight. I assure you, my king, if one of my men acted alone—" He didn't act alone. Calder's arm tightened, just slightly, around Marin's shoulders. "I know about the vote, Vey." Something in Vey's face went very still. "I know about the chamber with no windows," Calder said. "I know the date. I know which 4 witnesses signed it. And I know that until tonight, I was prepared to let it stay a secret, because I believed, wrongly. I see now that secrecy could protect her better than truth could. I was wrong. So we're going to do this differently." He turned then, Marin still half inside the circle of his arm, and faced not just Vey, but the corridor full of guards and household staff that had gathered, drawn by the noise, the way crowds always gather around the sound of something breaking. "Tomorrow," Calder said, loud enough now that it carried, loud enough that there would be no version of this anyone could later claim not to have heard, "I will stand in the great hall, in front of every member of this court, and I will tell them the truth about the night I rejected this woman in front of all of you. I will tell them what I was protecting her from, and I will tell them what I am no longer willing to hide. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to bring it to me directly, in daylight, with their own name attached to it. Not in the dark, not with a borrowed blade, not against an unarmed woman in a locked room." Vey said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't be its own confession. "Get him out of my sight," Calder said, to the guard captain, and didn't watch him go. The great hall, the next evening, was fuller than it had been the night of the rejection. Word travels faster than truth ever does, and by the time the doors opened, every soul in Aldermere with a reason to be curious had found one. Marin stood where she'd stood before, the same 10 paces of cold stone, the same hearth roaring at her back. The only difference was that this time, Calder did not stand on the dais looking down at her like a debt he wanted settled. This time he came down the dais steps and stood beside her. The murmur that went through the hall was its own kind of confession. 400 people recalibrating in real time. The gossip of weeks rearranging itself into a shape none of them had predicted. 3 weeks ago, Calder said, and his voice filled the hall the way it always did, except this time there was nothing cold in it. "I stood on this dais and told you all that I felt nothing for this woman. I told you it was a presumption on her part, a misunderstanding she'd mistaken for promise. I want you to know that every word of that was a lie, and I told it deliberately. Because I had learned that a faction within this court had voted in secret to kill any woman I bonded with who wasn't born to the 7 founding packs. I believed that performing contempt for her in public was the only way to keep her alive long enough for me to find another solution. He paused. The hall did not breathe. 2 nights ago, that faction sent armed men into her chamber in the dark. They broke her door. They drew a blade on an unarmed woman. They very nearly succeeded, and the only reason they did not is because she fought back with a fire iron and more courage than any of you watching tonight have ever been asked to find in your own lives. His hand found Marin's, in front of everyone, fingers lacing through hers without hesitation, without performance, the opposite of a grip meant to look like rejection. I was wrong to hide this, he said. I was wrong to think a lie, however well-intentioned, was a kindness. I will not make that mistake again. This woman is not a presumption. She is not a misunderstanding. She is the bond I have been trying, badly, to protect since the night I met her, and from this point forward I will protect her in the light, where everyone can see exactly what it costs me, because I have learned that hiding the cost only ever made it more dangerous, not less. Lady Sorrel, near the back of the hall, did not smile this time. Her hand found her husband's arm, and even from a distance, Marin could see something pass between them. The particular look of 2 people realizing, in the same instant, that the ground they'd been standing on had just become very public, very documented, and very unforgiving. Lord Vey did not speak. He had not been permitted to attend, technically. Calder's guard had seen to that, a quiet, deliberate exclusion that everyone in the hall understood without needing it explained. His absence said more than his presence could have. What Marin remembered most after, more than the speech, more than the murmur of 400 recalculating courtiers, more than the particular satisfaction of watching a faction that had tried to kill her stand exposed in front of the whole kingdom, was the moment just before Calder finished speaking, when he turned to look at her instead of the crowd. I am not asking you to forgive the corridor, he said, quieter now, just for her, though the whole hall could hear it anyway. I am not asking you to forget that I let you believe, even for one night, that you meant nothing to me. I am asking you to let me spend every day after this one, proving that I will never again choose the easy lie over the dangerous truth where you're concerned. The hall waited. 400 people, holding their breath for a second time in 3 weeks, waiting to see what the merchant's daughter with the white streak in her hair would do. With a king's apology offered in front of everyone who'd watched him discard her. I'm not doing this because of the bond, Marin said finally, and her voice didn't shake. I want that understood. Not by the court, by you. She looked at him, not the hall, not the dais, not the 400 witnesses recalibrating their gossip in real time. If I choose you, it will be because you chose to tell the truth when it was hardest, not because some thread in my chest pulled tight every time you walked into a room. The bond doesn't get credit for this. You do, or you don't, depending what you do next. Something in Calder's face, the careful king's mask he'd worn through every public moment since she'd known him, cracked open, just slightly, just enough. Understood, he said. It wasn't a full surrender on her part. It wasn't meant to be. She squeezed his hand once, in front of everyone, and let the rest of the answer stay unspoken. Between them, where the truest things between them had always lived anyway, Lord Vey did not survive the inquiry that followed with his council seat intact. The chamber with no windows was opened, finally, to proper witnesses. The vote was read aloud in full, in front of the Iron Council itself, and the 4 men who'd signed it stood and listened to their own names spoken back to them like a verdict, because by then it was won. Vey did not grovel. Not exactly. Pride doesn't break that cleanly, even when everything else does. But he stood in the council chamber 3 days later, stripped of his seat, his livery confiscated down to the last plum and gray thread, and said, in a voice gone thin and careful, that he had believed he was protecting the founding pack's birthright. Calder did not accept the excuse. He did not need to. The stripped seat said everything that needed saying. Sorrel left the court within the week. No one saw her go. The hairpin shaped like a thorn, tilted at its precise 12 degrees, was simply absent one morning, and the gossip that filled the gap was, for once, gossip Marin felt no need to correct or explain. Marin herself did not move into the king's wing. That surprised the court more than almost anything else that followed. More than the speech, more than the inquiry, more than watching Calder personally escort her every morning for a month, from the treasury to the herb garden and back, an open, unhidden, faintly absurd display of devotion from a man the court had spent years calling unreadable. "You could move your things tomorrow," he told her. One of those mornings, the dew still silver on the rosemary. No one would question it now. "I know, but you won't. Not yet." She turned the leaf between her fingers, not looking at him. "I spent 3 weeks watching you decide, on my behalf, what truth I could survive knowing. I'm not in a hurry to hand you the rest of my choices, just because the danger's gone quiet. I want to know I'm choosing this every day, not just inheriting it because a thread in my chest says I should." He didn't argue. That, more than anything he'd said in the Great Hall, was what convinced her he'd actually changed. Not the speech, not the public hand-holding, but the quiet, daily willingness to let her set the pace of her own becoming. The bruise on her wrist had long since faded by the time she finally did move her things. 11 weeks later, on a day she chose without telling him in advance, carrying one trunk down one corridor while the court, for once, paid her no attention at all, because by then the story had stopped being scandal and started being simply true. She never did find out, not with certainty, why the mark had bloomed so dark from a grip that hadn't been hard enough to leave one. Calder had his theories. Something about a bond announcing itself before either of them was ready to hear it. Something about a thread that didn't care what was performed in a hall full of witnesses. Marin had her own theory, quieter, one she never said aloud even to him, that some marks aren't made by pressure at all, that some marks are made by the body remembering, before the mind catches up, exactly who it already belongs to. She kept the white streak in her hair. She stopped hating it the season. She stopped hating most things about herself. Not because a king had chosen her in front of his whole court, though that helped, but because somewhere between a corridor confession and a fire iron swung in the dark, she had learned what she was capable of protecting on her own. The court still talks about the night of the rejection. They talk about it less now than they talk about what came after. The apology given in daylight, the hand-holding no one had asked for, the particular, startling sight of their cold king walking a treasury girl to a garden every morning, like a man still proving something to himself as much as to her. But every so often, late at night, in halls where the torches burn low and the gossip turns honest, someone will ask the question that started it all, the one the title of every version of this story still promises to answer, and never quite finishes answering. Why reject her in the light, only to follow her into the dark? And the answer, the only one that was ever true, is the one Calder gave her in that first corridor and never once took back. Because some things, performed badly enough in front of enough witnesses, become the only way to keep what you can't yet say out loud alive, long enough to say it properly, later, somewhere darker, somewhere safer, somewhere no one is watching except the one person it was always, only, ever for. What nobody in that hall ever learned, what Marin herself only half suspected, and never confirmed, not even years on, was whether Vey had acted entirely alone in giving that order to break her door, or whether someone closer to the throne, someone who'd smiled at her once in a garden with too many teeth and called it a warning, had known exactly which night to be elsewhere when it happened. Some doors, once closed, don't open again. Some questions are better left to ache quietly, in the space where the truth almost was.